It has always seemed to me one of the strangest tragedies of human life that we, who were made for the blazing light of the sun, so often content ourselves with shadows. If you were to enter a cave and see men sitting with their backs to the entrance, gazing upon the dim and shifting silhouettes on the wall, you might pity them for mistaking those faint outlines for reality. Yet that, I fear, is a fair description of our condition when we sin, for sin is not usually a deliberate preference for evil in its raw and hideous form. It is rather the choosing of something less when the greater has been offered, the preferring of the dim glow of a candle when the glory of noonday is streaming outside. Sin, in other words, is not so much rebellion in its loudest cry, but forgetfulness, the quiet betrayal of settling for shadows when the sun himself calls us to step into his light. When I speak of sin, I do not mean simply the catalogue of outward misdeeds that fill our newspapers or scandalize polite society. Those, grievous as they are merely the fruits of a deeper disorder. At the root, sin is an inward turning away from the source of our being. It is the soul curving in upon itself, seeking satisfaction in things too small to bear the weight of its eternal longing. To sin is, in essence, to mistake the created for the Creator, to take the gift and spurn the giver, to seize upon fragments of beauty while ignoring the fountain from which they flow. We must recognize that sin is rarely glamorous. In fact, its common form is drab, habitual, and tedious. A man who clings to envy or pride or lust is not really indulging in something large and free. He is narrowing his soul, folding it in upon itself until it becomes less capable of receiving joy. Imagine trying to fill a clenched fist with water. You cannot, for it must first be opened. And so it is with the human heart. As long as it is locked upon itself, it cannot receive the sunlight of divine love. Sin, then, is a choice for less. It is the preference for a husk when bread has been laid before us, the chasing of shadows when the sun shines warmly just beyond the cave. This explains why even the most ardent sinners often confess, in quiet moments, a sense of emptiness. They know, if only dimly, that they have traded gold for dust, eternal joy for fleeting pleasure. I have often thought that if we could see sin for what it truly is, its pettiness, its hollowness, its sheer unreality, we would flee from it as from a burning house. But the tragedy lies in this. Sin dresses itself in disguises. Pride masquerades as dignity, greed as prudence, lust as love. The shadows on the wall of the cave appear to dance, and the soul imagines it sees life when in fact it beholds only the dim outline of reality. Consider this: the devil has no power to create. He cannot invent pleasures or goods. He can only twist what God has already made. Every sin, therefore, is a distortion of something good. Lust is the corruption of love, greed, the corruption of provision, pride, the corruption of dignity, idolatry, the corruption of worship. In every case, the sinner does not desire pure evil. No one desires misery for its own sake. But he desires some good thing wrongly, apart from its true center in God. That is why sin is both so seductive and so disappointing, for it promises what it cannot deliver. Let us not think, then, that God forbids sin because he is a cosmic killjoy, jealous of our small pleasures. On the contrary, he forbids it because he loves us too much to let us be fooled by counterfeits. He is like a father who sees his child playing with mud pies in a slum when a holiday by the sea has been prepared. Sin, in its deepest sense, is not merely badness, it is blindness. It is the failure to see that the sun is shining, and that only in his light do the shadows find their true place. And yet the stubbornness of the human heart is remarkable. We will cling to our shadows even when the sun himself steps into the cave. Christ comes, not merely to instruct us, but to rescue us, to lift us from the world of silhouettes into the blazing world of reality. And here we must confront a difficult truth. Sin cannot be coddled. It cannot be tamed, polished, or adjusted. It must be surrendered. For as long as we insist on holding the shadow, our hands will remain too full to grasp the substance. To understand the nature of sin is, therefore, to understand the urgency of grace. For if sin is the preference for shadows, grace is the gentle insistence of God that we were made for light. Grace does not simply scold, it awakens. It is as if Christ were to open the shutters of a darkened room, letting in the morning sun, so that we might see both the dust we had ignored and the beauty beyond the window. But here lies the paradox. We often resist this light. We fear it will expose what we would rather hide. We cling to the cave because we have grown accustomed to it, even though the damp and darkness breed only weariness. Yet Christ tells us again and again that he has not come to condemn us to our shadows, but to lead us into life. Sin is a prison, but one whose bars dissolve the moment we step into the radiance of God's mercy. If sin is choosing the shadow over the sun, then repentance is the turning of the head, the slow, sometimes painful realization that the shadows are not enough. It is the decision, however faltering, to rise and walk toward the light. Repentance is not merely regret for what one has done. It is a reorientation of the entire soul. One might say it is the posture of a flower, turning toward the sun after a long night, instinctively opening its petals to the warmth that alone can bring life. Now, it is worth noting that sin thrives on secrecy. Like mold that grows best in darkness, it festers when hidden. The sinner's great fear is exposure, but God's great mercy is that he exposes not to shame, but to heal. The light may sting the eyes at first, the heart may resist the intrusion of truth, but only in the radiance of God's presence is there cleansing. Only there is there the possibility of becoming whole. Many suppose that the Christian life is chiefly about avoiding sin, as though God were simply a watchman keeping tally of our missteps. But the truth is far grander. God does not call us out of the cave merely to leave us standing bewildered outside. He calls us into a life of joy, of freedom, of reality so rich that our shadows look thin and pale by comparison. Christianity is not simply the renunciation of sin, it is the embrace of a greater love. It is not the extinguishing of desire, but its redirection toward the one who alone can satisfy it. Imagine a man starving who clutches at crumbs fallen from the table, not realizing that a feast has been set before him. That is the soul in sin. It is not that his hunger is too strong, but that his vision is too weak. He has mistaken the crumbs for the banquet. Sin shrivels our desires. Grace enlarges them. Christ does not say, desire less. He says, desire more. Desire what is real, what is lasting, what is eternal. This helps us to see why sin always ends in disappointment. It may glitter for a time, it may intoxicate for a moment, but at last it reveals itself as dust and ashes. The forbidden fruit is always more alluring before it is bitten. Once tasted, its sweetness quickly fades, and the heart longs again, emptier than before. Whereas Christ, the bread of life, satisfies and yet enlarges our hunger, so that the more we taste of Him, the more we long for Him, and the more deeply we are fulfilled. It is no small thing to say that sin is death, not merely death at the end of life, but death creeping into life even now. Every act of selfishness, every refusal of love, every clinging to pride is a participation in death. It is a turning from the fountain of living water toward a cistern that can hold none. The wages of sin are not simply imposed from without. They grow within, as rot grows within fruit. And yet, if sin is death, then Christ is life. He is not merely the opposite of sin, but the healing of it. The great tragedy of sin is that it makes us less than what we were meant to be. Shadows of men and women, diminished versions of ourselves. The great triumph of Christ is that He restores us to our true selves. In Him, we are not less human, but more fully human. In Him, we are not reduced to shadows, but brought into the substance of reality. This is why the saints, those imperfect but faithful pilgrims who went before us, always radiated a peculiar joy. They had discovered the secret, that holiness is not a narrowing, but an expansion, not a grim denial, but a liberating affirmation of life. They had learned that sin makes the soul small, but grace makes it spacious. They had learned, in short, to step out of the cave and live under the sun. And here, I must confess, even as I speak these words, I know how easily the human heart slips back into the shadows. Conversion is not a one-time glance at the light, but a daily turning, a constant renewal of vision. Every morning we must rise and choose again. Will I live in the cave of shadows, or in the light of the sun? The Christian life is a long apprenticeship in learning to love the light. But oh, what a master we have! He is patient with our stumbling, gentle with our weakness, and relentless in His love. He will not leave us to our shadows, for He has promised that those who follow Him will not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. If we are to speak truthfully, we must admit that one of the most insidious aspects of sin is its ability to disguise itself as freedom. The sinner thinks he is asserting his independence, throwing off restraints, living by his own rules. But in reality, he is exchanging the vast fields of God's kingdom for the narrow confines of his own desires. True freedom is not found in doing as we please, but in becoming what we were made to be. A fish is not free when it leaves the water, however bravely it flops upon the sand. It is free only when it moves according to its nature, in the currents of the sea for which it was created. So too, man is not free when he abandons God. He is free only when he lives in the light of God's truth and love. Sin, therefore, is not liberation, but bondage. The proud man is a slave to his reputation, the greedy man to his possessions, the lustful man to his appetites. Each imagines himself master, but each is chained. It is the meek, the humble, the pure in heart who are truly free, for they have surrendered to the one whose yoke is easy and whose burden is light. Here is the paradox at the heart of Christianity. To yield to God is to find yourself. To resist Him is to lose yourself. Now, many of us are tempted to think of sin only in terms of what is grand and shocking: murder, betrayal, violence. But the truth is that sin in its most common form is quiet, respectable, and socially acceptable. It is the small selfishness that corrodes love, the unnoticed pride that inflates the heart, the subtle indifference to God that seeps into our days like fog. If we wait for sin to appear only in its most monstrous guises, we will never recognize the way it is already threading its roots through the soil of our souls. And yet, even in this, there is hope. For the God who calls us out of the shadows is not blind to how deep those shadows run. He knows our frailty. He knows how often we cling to the cave wall, but He has not left us to fight this battle unaided. He has given us His Spirit, the very light of His presence dwelling within us, to guide us, convict us, and strengthen us. The Christian does not fight sin alone. He fights it with the very life of God surging within him. Indeed, the Christian life is less about our grip upon God than His grip upon us. We fall, and He lifts us. We wander, and He pursues us. We resist, and still He loves us. The story of salvation is not primarily about man climbing his way into the sunlight, but about God entering the cave, bearing the darkness upon His shoulders, and leading us out by His pierced hands. When Christ stretched His arms upon the cross, He gathered the shadows of the whole world into Himself. He bore the weight of our sin, not simply to cancel a debt, but to shatter the very prison of death. In Him, the cave has been breached, and the light has poured in. The resurrection is not merely a future hope. It is the dawn already breaking, the assurance that the shadows cannot last. Therefore, to follow Christ is to live in the tension of already and not yet. Already the light has come, and yet we still dwell in a world of shadows. Already we are free, and yet we still feel the tug of chains. Already the victory is won, and yet the battle continues within us. But the end is certain. The shadows are fading, the sun is rising, and one day we shall see Him face to face, with no shadow between. The longer I reflect upon the nature of sin, the more I see that it is not merely a moral failure, but a distortion of vision. Sin bends the eye so that it looks at the world wrongly, valuing what is trivial, neglecting what is eternal, fearing what is harmless, and ignoring what is truly dreadful. It is as if the soul wears a pair of spectacles that invert reality, so that shadows loom large while the sun itself is dimmed. The work of grace is to give us new sight, to restore the vision we were meant to have, to teach us again what is weighty and what is fleeting. Take, for example, pride. Few sins are more ordinary, and yet few are more blinding. The proud man sees all things in relation to himself. He cannot bear that another should be higher, brighter, or nearer to God than he. And so pride not only separates him from others, but from God Himself. For he cannot enter into the presence of the Almighty while still clinging to the illusion that He is the center. In that way, pride is not only a sin among others, it is the root that feeds them all. It is the ultimate choosing of shadow over sun, the self's insistence that it can provide its own light. Or consider lust. At first glance it seems like an indulgence of passion, a celebration of desire. Yet, in truth it reduces a person to an object, a mere shadow of their true dignity. Lust blinds us to the eternal soul of another, and fixes us only upon the flicker of passing sensation. It is like mistaking the shadow of a man on the wall for the man himself, grasping what is least real and missing what is most profound. Greed, too, works by narrowing our sight. It makes gold glitter brighter than glory, and possessions more desirable than people. The greedy man clutches at the shadow of wealth, failing to see that he himself is already infinitely richer than he knows if only he would look to God. For what treasure compares to being a son or daughter of the eternal King? What unites all these forms of sin is the same movement, the descent from reality to illusion, from substance to shadow. Sin shrinks the soul until it cannot see beyond itself. But the love of God does the opposite. It expands the soul, opens it outward, fills it with light, until even the smallest act, offered in Him, becomes radiant with eternal significance. Now, if we are honest, we must acknowledge how deeply this tendency toward shadow-dwelling runs within each of us. Sin is not only something we do, it is a condition into which we are born, a bentness of the will. That is why no amount of moral effort can save us. To imagine we can fix ourselves is like a man in the cave trying to polish the shadows until they shine. Only God can turn us toward the light. Only grace can reorient the heart. And here we find the hope that answers the despair of sin. We are not left in the dark. The God who made the sun has also made a way for us to see it. Christ is that way. He has entered the cave, carried our blindness, borne our chains, and led us out into the dawn. To follow Him is not to deny desire, but to discover its true fulfillment. For our souls were made for light, and only the Son of Righteousness can satisfy them. So the question remains for each of us: will we choose the shadow, or will we choose the sun? Day by day, moment by moment, life presents us with this choice, and in the end, every soul will have what it truly desires, either the flickering shadows of self or the blazing, joyous reality of God. If the essence of sin is choosing shadows over the sun, then the essence of salvation is God's refusal to let us remain satisfied with shadows. Think of it. Left to ourselves, we would go on clutching at dim silhouettes until the end of our days. But God, in His mercy, disturbs us. He unsettles our false peace. He awakens in us a hunger for more than the cave can offer. This hunger is often painful. It comes to us as restlessness, as dissatisfaction, sometimes even as despair. And yet, beneath it lies the hand of grace. For it is better to be restless in the cave than content in the dark. Restlessness is the seed of return, the whisper that there must be something more. This is why the deepest longings of the human heart are not accidents, but signposts. Every yearning for beauty, for truth, for love, for permanence is a shadow pointing beyond itself. Sin tries to capture the shadow and make it ultimate. Grace teaches us to follow the shadow back to the light. A melody awakens longing not because music itself is ultimate, but because it reminds us faintly of the music of heaven. A kiss awakens desire not because flesh alone satisfies, but because it points to the eternal communion for which the soul was made. Every earthly joy is a shadow, but not a false one. It is a shadow that leads us to the source of joy. If only we do not stop short and mistake the signpost for the destination. The tragedy of sin, then, is not that we desire too much, but that we desire too little. We settle for the lesser good and miss the greater. We are like children who, when offered the splendor of the sea, prefer to play with mud pies in the back garden, because we cannot imagine the glory of the waves. We treat temporal pleasures as though they were eternal, and in so doing we rob ourselves of the eternal joy they were meant to awaken in us. And here lies the heart of Christian conversion, not merely turning from vice to virtue, but from shadow to sun. Virtues themselves, apart from Christ, can become another kind of shadow. Pride in our goodness, vanity in our morality, self-sufficiency in our discipline. Only when all these are surrendered, only when the soul bows to the Son himself, does life become reality rather than illusion. Therefore, the call of the gospel is not first a command, but an invitation. Come out into the light. Christ does not shout from outside the cave, scolding us for loving the shadows. He enters in, sits beside us, and whispers that the shadows are not enough, that the light of His presence is what we were made for. He shows us His wounds, the cost of dragging us from darkness into dawn, and He bids us rise and follow Him. And when we do, however falteringly, we discover that what we feared to lose was never life at all, but only its imitation. Yes, the journey out of the cave is slow. Our eyes, long accustomed to darkness, ache when they first meet the sun. At times we are tempted to turn back, for the shadows are familiar and the light seems overwhelming. But if we press on, each step reveals more glory, until at last we realize that the light does not destroy us, but transfigures us. In it, we become what we were always meant to be, creatures radiant with the very life of God. For sin diminishes, but grace enlarges. Sin withers, but Christ makes alive. Sin traps us in shadows, but the Lord of light calls us to share in His brightness. And one day, when the story of the world reaches its true climax, we shall see Him as He is, and in seeing Him, we shall be like Him. Then the last shadow will vanish, the last cave be emptied, and the sun will reign without rival. One of the most sobering truths about sin is that it is not neutral. It never leaves a man as it finds him. To choose shadows today makes it easier to choose them tomorrow. The soul takes the shape of what it loves, just as a face grows weathered by years of expression, lines of laughter or bitterness carving themselves into the skin. So, too, does the soul bear the marks of its repeated choices. Each act of sin is like a stroke of the chisel, carving us into the likeness of the shadow we prefer. And in the end, if left unchecked, the soul may become unrecognizable even to itself, a prisoner of its own desires, unable to look at the sun without terror. Yet, the opposite is equally true. Every small surrender to the light, every humble act of obedience, every whispered yes to God shapes us into His likeness. Grace restores not only our standing before God, but our very nature. Holiness is not a foreign cloak draped over us. It is the restoration of what we were always meant to be. To live in Christ is to grow more human, more radiant, more real. This helps us to understand the eternal consequences of sin. Heaven and hell are not arbitrary rewards or punishments handed out at the end of life's exam. They are the natural fulfillment of the paths we have chosen. If we cling to shadows, if we train our eyes to reject the light, then what else could eternity be but darkness? And if we open ourselves to the light, if we allow Christ to reshape our desires, then what else could eternity be but glory? In the end, each soul receives what it has loved most. The sobering truth is that some will love the shadow more than the sun, and God, in His respect for their freedom, will not force them otherwise. But here is the good news. No one need remain in that cave. However long you have lingered in darkness, however many times you have preferred shadow to sun, the invitation remains open. The voice of Christ still echoes. Come forth. It is the same voice that called Lazarus from the tomb, the same voice that stilled the storm, the same voice that spoke light into the first dawn of creation. And it is speaking still, to you, to me, to every weary soul that has mistaken shadows for reality. And perhaps that is why we speak of the gospel as good news. It is not advice on how to polish the shadows or arrange them more attractively on the cave wall. It is the announcement that the true sun has risen, that death has been broken, that reality has entered the cave and shattered its darkness. To follow Christ is not to abandon joy, but to discover it, not to lose life, but to find it, not to surrender freedom, but to at last become free. My friends, the great danger is not that we desire too much, but that we are content with too little. The shadows are comfortable, but they cannot satisfy. They flicker and fade, leaving the soul hungrier than before. Only the living God can fill the infinite abyss within us, for He alone is infinite, and He offers Himself freely. Therefore, the question before us is not abstract or distant. It is personal and immediate. Which will we choose, the shadows or the sun? And so, as we near the end of this reflection, let me gather the threads together. Sin, I have said, is not usually the choosing of darkness for its own sake, but the settling for less when more has been offered. It is the preference for the fleeting shadow over the eternal sun. To sin is to diminish oneself, to refuse the great banquet of God for the crumbs of self-will. The tragedy is not that we hunger. It is that we mistake the husk for the harvest, the imitation for the real. But the story does not end in tragedy. For the God who made us for light has not abandoned us to the cave. The light has come into the world, and the darkness has not overcome it. Jesus Christ, the very radiance of the Father, entered our shadowed existence. He did not stand outside, beckoning us with vague promises. He stepped into the cave itself, bearing the weight of our blindness, the burden of our chains, and the penalty of our rebellion. And by His cross and resurrection, He has torn open the roof, letting the full blaze of the sun pour in. This is why the gospel is not simply good instruction, but good news. It does not tell us merely how to behave better in the cave. It tells us that the cave has been breached, that the way out is open, and that the Son Himself waits to welcome us. The Christian life, then, is not the grim effort of escaping darkness by our own strength, but the joyful yielding to One who has already carried us into the light. It is trust, surrender, and the daily learning to see with new eyes. And yes, the journey is slow. The eyes, so long adjusted to shadows, resist the brightness at first. There are days when the familiar darkness feels safer than the unknown light. But every step toward Christ enlarges the soul. Every yes to Him is a widening of vision, a foretaste of the glory yet to come. For He has promised that those who walk in Him shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. The final victory is sure. One day, all shadows will be dispersed, One day no soul who clings to Christ will ever again stumble in half-light. One day the great sun will rise, never to set, and we shall live in his radiance forever. That is the promise of redemption, not only pardon for our sins, but the restoration of our very being into the likeness of Christ himself. So the choice is laid before us. Will we go on preferring shadows, mistaking them for substance? Or will we step out into the light of the sun, where joy is no longer fragile, where love no longer fades, and where life itself is eternal? My dear friends, I urge you, do not settle for the shadow when the sun himself calls you by name. Lift your eyes, open your hands, and receive the light. For you were made for nothing less than the blazing glory of God. If you have found something of worth in these reflections, I invite you to journey further with us. Do like this video, share it with those who walk beside you in the cave, leave a comment with your own thoughts, and subscribe to our channel, that together we may continue seeking the light of the sun who never fails.